But we begin with the standoff over Ukraine. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke for an hour Saturday morning about the escalating tensions in Eastern Europe. In a tweet, the White House said President Biden made it clear that if Russia further invades Ukraine, the United States and its allies will, quote, impose swift and severe costs on Russia. This comes amid growing fears that Moscow could launch an attack on Ukraine in just a matter of days. The State Department is already preparing by ordering most embassy staff to leave the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv and warning Americans to leave Ukraine. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says all of this is creating panic, something he says is not helping his country.
The truth that we have different information, and now the best friend for enemies, that is panic in our country. And all this information that helps only for panic doesn't help us.
Meanwhile, a CBS News YouGov poll reveals 53% of Americans believe the U.S. should stay out of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. For more on this, I'd like to bring in CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini, who is there at the White House. Christina, you have been on top of this since the very beginning. As we just heard, President Zelensky made a point to say that there's a lot of information out there that he believes is creating panic. To his point, back in December, we were told to expect an invasion could be coming in January. What do we know about the intelligence at this point and how reliable these sources actually are?
Well, I mean, it depends on what government you want to go with, right? The U.S. has said that the reason it's coming forward with all this intelligence that Russia is ready to invade, that invasion could come as soon as next week, is because twofold. It wants to try to deter Russia, to try to get them to come to some sort of diplomatic agreement, although time is running out on that, and because it feels it has an obligation to warn Americans, to warn diplomats to get U.S. assets out of the country if they think they're in harm's way. Now, President Zelensky, for his part, he's got his own domestic population to worry about. Look, this war has been going on since 2014, and it's been really bad for the Ukrainian economy. So by what he's saying is all these warnings, he's almost gone so far as to call it fear-mongering, is shaking the Ukrainian economy. And if the economy tumbles, his government collapse, and that could be a whole different kind of risk to Ukraine. So you have to think about what each leader's goals are and why their rhetoric would match that. So it's not necessarily a battle of intelligence, because intelligence reports are a little bit like numbers. If you torture them long enough, they're going to confess to whatever you want them to say. They're just emphasizing the parts of it that they want to deliver to their domestic audience.
I haven't heard it explained in quite that fashion, Christina, but understood. Well, the White House tells us that President Biden had stern words when he was having that conversation with President Putin. Mr. Biden also spoke with European allies on Saturday. What can you tell us about those calls, and how is Russia responding?
Well, President Biden spoke to President Putin for about an hour this morning, and you read some of what the White House said. But, you know, a senior official told us there wasn't any big diplomatic breakthrough on that call, and they didn't get any kind of indication that Russia is changing its position. Now, the Russians have given their own readout on the call, and they said they didn't think the U.S. was pressing the Ukrainians hard enough to reach a peace deal, whereas the Europeans have said Russia isn't trying hard enough to come to the table and come to negotiations. So it matters that these leaders are still talking. It matters that they've said they're going to try to keep talking next week, even as this, I don't want to call it a deadline, but as this kind of looming alert the U.S. has put out that Russia has, by now it's probably close to 90% of the forces it would need to launch this full-scale invasion. The rest are on the way, and it could be ready to do so as soon as next week. But the U.S. has said, look, this is too dangerous. The risk is too high for us not to give Russia every opportunity to find a diplomatic solution to this problem.
And at the same time that that's going on, the U.S. is removing Florida National Guard troops from Ukraine, sending them over the border, as I understand it. And at the same time, they're also sending some 3,000 troops to Poland. Tell us, Christina, what kind of message is this sending to Russia, and how is it also being perceived by our allies?
Well, in an interview with NBC News, President Biden was asked, look, if we need to rescue Americans, are these U.S. forces going to go into Ukraine? And he said no. You know, that's part of the reason we heard from Jake Sullivan yesterday saying, if you are an American and you're in Ukraine, the time now is to leave because the U.S. military will not come rescue you. What President Biden said is, look, if you have U.S. troops shooting at Russian forces or vice versa, that's World War III, and that's not something that he wants. That's not something any of us want. So in an effort to kind of deconflict and avoid any kind of direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, they are removing this National Guard unit. Now, the troops that are going in are not going into Ukraine, and I think that's something we need to emphasize because there seems to be a little bit of confusion there. Those forces are going to back up U.S. allies. There are units already in Poland and Romania. There are 3,000 more troops headed to Poland, and what they're going to do there is they're going to help kind of reinforce that border should Putin go into Ukraine. You know, the fear is if he may decide to venture further, and they want to make sure there's a big deterrent there to stop him if need be. They'll also be in place to help Americans leaving and to kind of catch refugees if they start flooding over the border, which is something we've not seen.
Okay. Christina, thank you.